The afternoon sun was warm as Mrs. Unipark walked down Oak Street. Her white cane moved from side to side, helping her feel the path ahead. She had walked this route to the grocery store for 20 years, and she knew every crack in the sidewalk. Mrs. Park carried a small bag of groceries in her left hand. Inside were ingredients for her son's favorite soup. Jeho was coming to dinner tonight, and she wanted to make something special. Even though he was now a police captain, to her he was still the little boy who loved her cooking. The streets were quiet today. Mrs. Park could hear birds singing and leaves rustling in the trees. She smiled as she remembered how she used to teach her students about listening. Music isn't just about playing notes, she would tell them. It's about hearing the world around you. As she neared the corner of Maple Avenue, she heard fast footsteps coming toward her. Something felt wrong. The steps were heavy and angry. "Stop right there," a man's voice shouted. Mrs. Park stopped walking, holding her cane firmly. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked calmly. She could tell it was a police officer by the jingling of equipment on his belt. "There was a break-in reported in this area," the officer said sharply. "What are you doing here?" "I live 3 blocks away," Mrs. Park explained. "I'm walking home from Burton's grocery. I can show you my ID." "Don't move," Officer Walsh ordered as Mrs. Park reached slowly for her purse. His voice was filled with suspicion and anger. Some people had stopped walking. Mrs. Park could hear them whispering. She stayed calm, remembering what Jeho had taught her about dealing with police officers. "Officer, I am blind," she said clearly. "This is my white cane. I'm just trying to get my identification for you." "Sure you are," Officer Walsh said. He didn't believe her. "That stick could be a weapon. Hand it over." Mrs. Park held her cane tighter. "Officer, please. I need my cane to walk. Look at the red markings on it. This is a standard mobility cane for blind people." More people were gathering now. Mrs. Park could hear phones recording video. She wished someone would help, but she understood their fear. "I said give it to me." Officer Walsh grabbed the cane roughly. Mrs. Park tried to hold on, but he was too strong. The sound of breaking plastic cut through the air. Mrs. Park's heart sank as she heard her cane snap. Without it, she felt lost in darkness. "Now let's see your ID," Officer Walsh demanded, throwing the broken pieces of the cane on the ground. Mrs. Park stood very straight, her hands shaking slightly. "Officer, you have just destroyed my mobility cane. I would like you to call my son. He is Captain Jeho Park of the 12th Precinct." There was a long silence. Even the whispers stopped. Mrs. Park could almost feel Officer Walsh's shock. I don't believe you," he stammered, but his voice had lost its anger. Now there was fear in it. "Then call the station," Mrs. Park said quietly. "Ask for Captain Park. Tell him his mother needs him at the corner of Oak and Maple. Tell him what you did to my cane." A kind voice spoke from the crowd. "Mrs. Park, I'm Susan from the bakery. I recorded everything. Would you like me to help you call your son?" "Thank you, Susan," Mrs. Park said. She could hear Officer Walsh backing away. She stood still, waiting for Jeho, knowing that this incident would change many lives, including her own. The afternoon sun was still warm, but Mrs. Park felt cold inside. She thought about her students, about Jeho, about this angry officer. There was so much work to be done, so many bridges to build. Maybe, she thought, this was where it would begin. Officer Walsh stood frozen on the sidewalk. His hands were shaking as he looked at the broken pieces of the white cane. More people had gathered around them, and many held up their phones to record. The afternoon traffic moved slowly as drivers turned their heads to watch. Mrs. Park remained standing straight, her dignity intact despite her difficult situation. She could hear people muttering angrily about the officer's behavior. Without her cane, she felt vulnerable, but she refused to show fear. "Mrs. Park," Susan from the bakery said gently, "I called Captain Park. He's on his way. Would you like to sit on the bench while we wait?" "Thank you, Susan," Mrs. Park replied. Could you guide me to it? As Susan carefully helped Mrs. Park to the nearby bench, Officer Walsh found his voice again. Everyone needs to clear the area, he ordered, but his words lacked their earlier authority. An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd. We're not going anywhere, he said firmly. We all saw what you did. Officer Walsh reached for his radio, his face red with embarrassment and anger. Dispatch, this is Officer Walsh. I need backup at Oak and Maple. Mrs. Park spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the tense scene. Officer Walsh, more police officers won't change what happened here. You chose to break my cane even after I explained my situation. Now you must face the consequences of that choice. A police siren sounded in the distance, growing louder. Officer Walsh's face turned pale. He knew it wasn't the backup he had called for. 2 minutes later, a police car stopped at the corner. Captain Jaiho Park stepped out, his face serious as he surveyed the scene. He saw his mother sitting calmly on the bench, the broken pieces of her cane on the ground, and Officer Walsh standing uncomfortably to the side. Mother, Jaiho said softly, walking to her, are you hurt? No, son, Mrs. Park answered, reaching out to touch his hand. But I am deeply disappointed. This officer refused to listen when I identified myself as a blind person. He destroyed my cane despite my explanations. Captain Park turned to face Officer Walsh, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. Officer Walsh, he said, his voice firm and professional, please explain your actions. Sir, there was a report of a break-in. Officer Walsh stammered. I thought the cane might be a weapon. I didn't believe she was really blind. Did you ask for identification? Captain Park questioned. She reached for her purse, and Officer Walsh's voice trailed off. And you responded with force instead of patience, Captain Park finished. He looked at the crowd, noting the phones recording everything. Susan, you said you have video of the incident. Yes, Captain. Susan replied. I recorded everything from the moment Officer Walsh approached Mrs. Park. Captain Park nodded. Thank you. I'll need a copy of that video. He turned back to Officer Walsh. Officer, you will return to the station immediately and write a detailed report of this incident. Then you will wait in my office. As Officer Walsh hurried to his patrol car, Captain Park carefully picked up the pieces of his mother's broken cane. He studied them silently, his face showing the pain of seeing his mother treated this way. Jaiho, Mrs. Park said softly, this is an opportunity, not just a tragedy. Perhaps we can use this incident to teach others. Captain Park looked at his mother with admiration. Even in this difficult moment, she was thinking about how to help others learn and grow. He took a deep breath and made a decision. Mother, you're right, he said. This won't be swept under the rug. We're going to make real changes, starting today. Captain Jaiho Park sat at his desk in the 12th precinct, watching the video of the incident for the third time. Each viewing made his heart heavier. On his desk lay the broken pieces of his mother's cane, a reminder of how quickly trust could be broken. 20 minutes earlier, he had been leading a meeting about improving police relations with the community. Now he had to deal with a crisis that struck at the heart of everything he worked for and everything he loved. Officer Walsh waited outside his office. Through the glass walls, Captain Park could see the man's nervous movements. Other officers walked past, some giving Walsh cold looks. Word had spread quickly about what happened to Mrs. Park. Captain Park's phone buzzed. It was a message from his trusted colleague, Officer Ha-won Kim. Sir, the video is already on social media. News vans are gathering outside. He looked at a photo on his desk, his mother teaching at her music school, helping a young student position their hands on a piano. She had always taught him that every mistake was a chance to learn. Now he had to decide how to handle this mistake by one of his officers. There was a knock at his door. Come in, Captain Park called. Officer Kim entered, holding a folder. Sir, I have Officer Walsh's report, she said, and there's something else you should see. She handed him another paper. It was Walsh's record from his previous precinct. 3 complaints about aggressive behavior, all involving minority citizens. Each time, Walsh had been cleared of wrongdoing. Captain Park closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his decision was made. "Send him in," he told Officer Kim. Officer Walsh entered the office, standing stiffly at attention. His face was pale, and sweat showed on his forehead. "Sit down, Officer Walsh," Captain Park said calmly. He turned his computer screen so Walsh could see the video. "I want you to watch this with me." Together, they watched the scene unfold. Mrs. Park explaining she was blind, Walsh refusing to listen, the cane breaking. Walsh's face grew paler with each moment. "What do you see?" Captain Park asked when the video ended. "Sir, Walsh struggled to find words. "I see myself failing to serve and protect. I see myself hurting someone who needed help." "Good." Captain Park nodded. "That's a start. Now, I could suspend you, or I could transfer you out. Many people would say that's what you deserve." Walsh looked at the floor, waiting for his punishment. "But my mother," Captain Park continued, "has a different idea. She believes this can be a teaching moment. Not just for you, but for our entire department." Walsh looked up, surprise clear on his face. "Starting tomorrow," Captain Park said, "you will participate in a new training program. My mother will help design it. You will learn what it means to navigate the world without sight. You will understand why a cane isn't just a stick of plastic. It's someone's connection to the world." He leaned forward, his voice firm, but not angry. "This is not a gentle auction, Officer Walsh. It will be hard. You will face your prejudices. You will feel uncomfortable. But if you commit to learning, you can help us make real change." Walsh sat straighter in his chair. "Yes, sir. I understand." "Do you?" Captain Park asked. "Because this isn't just about making things right with my mother. This is about making sure no officer ever makes this mistake again." Outside the office, the precinct was buzzing with activity. News about the incident was spreading. Phones were ringing. But inside, 2 men sat in silence, thinking about the path ahead. Finally, Walsh spoke. "Sir, will Mrs. Park be okay without her cane?" "I've already ordered her a new one," Captain Park replied. "The question is, Officer Walsh, will you be ready to face her again when it arrives?" The Internal Affairs Office was quiet except for the sound of papers being sorted. Detective Maya Chen read through Officer Walsh's file for the second time. 3 previous complaints sat in front of her, along with the new incident report about Mrs. Park's broken cane. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Captain Park entered, looking tired but composed. "Detective Chen, thank you for meeting with me." "Please sit down, Captain," Chen replied. "I know this is a difficult situation, given your connection to the case." Captain Park sat in the chair across from her desk. "I want to be clear, Detective. I'm not here to influence your investigation. I'm here to share a proposal." Chen leaned forward, interested. "What kind of proposal?" "My mother has suggested creating a new training program," Captain Park explained. "One that addresses the root of the problem we saw yesterday." Detective Chen looked at the files spread across her desk. "Captain, with Officer Walsh's history, this incident calls for serious disciplinary action." "I agree," Captain Park nodded. "But punishment alone won't prevent this from happening again. We need to change how officers think and act." Chen picked up the latest incident report. "Tell me about this training program." Captain Park described his mother's idea. Officers would learn what it meant to be blind by experiencing it themselves. They would use white canes, navigate familiar spaces without sight, and understand the trust required between police and vulnerable citizens. Officer Walsh would be the first participant, Captain Park finished. Under close supervision, of course. Detective Chen was quiet for a moment. "This is unusual," she said finally. "Internal Affairs typically recommends suspension or termination in cases like this. Sometimes unusual problems need unusual solutions," Captain Park replied. My mother believes that understanding comes through experience. Just then, Officer Kim knocked and entered quickly. Sir, you need to see this. She held up her phone, showing a news website. The video of the incident had gone viral. Comments were pouring in from around the country. People were demanding action. Detective Chen read the headline. Blind woman's cane broken by officer. Son is police captain. The press is outside. Officer Kim reported. They want statements from both you and Officer Walsh. Captain Park looked at Detective Chen. We need to act quickly, he said. This isn't just about one incident anymore. It's about showing that we can learn from our mistakes and make real changes. Detective Chen stood up and walked to her window. Below, she could see news vans gathering. Your mother, she said slowly, she's willing to help with this training, even after what happened. Yes, Captain Park answered. She sees beyond anger to possibility. Chen turned back to her desk and picked up a pen. I'll need to see a detailed plan for this training program, she said. And Officer Walsh will still face other consequences. But, she paused, looking at Captain Park, I think your mother might be right. We need more than just punishment here. She began writing in her report. I'll recommend a combination of approaches. The training program, supervised community service, and a formal reprimand in Officer Walsh's file. But Captain, she looked up seriously, this needs to work. A lot of people will be watching. Captain Park stood up. Thank you, Detective. I understand. He turned to leave but stopped at the door. My mother is teaching her music class right now, he said quietly. She didn't let this incident stop her from doing what she loves. That's the kind of strength we need to learn from. Detective Chen nodded, understanding. As Captain Park left her office, she began writing her recommendations. Sometimes, she thought, justice could come in unexpected forms. The community center was filled to capacity. People sat shoulder to shoulder in metal folding chairs, and more stood along the walls. At the front of the room, Mrs. Park sat next to her son, her new carbon fiber cane resting against her chair. The room buzzed with angry voices. Mr. Lee, the community center director, stood at the microphone. Please, he called out, let's give Mrs. Park a chance to speak. The room fell silent as Mrs. Park rose and walked to the microphone, one hand touching her son's shoulder for guidance. She stood straight, facing the crowd with quiet dignity. Thank you all for coming, she began. I know many of you are angry about what happened to me. The video has caused much pain in our community. A voice called out from the crowd. We need to protest. That officer should be fired. Mrs. Park raised her hand gently. I understand your anger. But today I want to talk about something different. I want to talk about change. The room grew quieter, listening intently. For 30 years, I have taught music in this community, Mrs. Park continued. I have taught students from all backgrounds. When they first come to me, many are afraid to make mistakes, but I tell them that mistakes are how we learn. She gestured toward the crowd. The officer who broke my cane made a terrible mistake, but now we have a choice. We can stay angry, or we can use this moment to create real change. Captain Park watched his mother with pride as she explained her idea for the training program. She described how officers would learn to navigate without sight, how they would understand the trust required when someone cannot see. My son and I have already started working with the police department, she said. Officer Walsh will be the first to go through this training, but he will not be the last. A young woman stood up. Mrs. Park, I was there that day. I recorded the video. How can you be so forgiving? Mrs. Park smiled gently. This isn't about forgiveness. This is about transformation. Every day in my music class, I see how understanding grows through experience. We cannot expect police officers to understand our experiences if we don't help them learn. The crowd began to murmur, but now the tone was different. People were talking about possibilities instead of protests. An elderly man raised his hand. I work with disabled veterans. Could they participate in the training? Share their experiences. Yes, Mrs. Park nodded. This program will grow with community input. We all have something to teach and something to learn. Captain Park stepped forward. The police department is committed to this program. We want to work with the community, not against it. As the meeting continued, more people offered to help. A local business owner volunteered his space for training sessions. A teacher offered to document the program so other cities could learn from it. Later that evening, as Captain Park drove his mother home, she touched his arm. "Do you hear that, Jiho?" "Hear what, Mother?" "The sound of minds opening," she said softly. "It's like when a student finally understands a difficult piece of music. Change doesn't always come with loud protests. Sometimes it comes in quiet moments of understanding." Captain Park smiled as he drove through the familiar streets. His mother had turned a moment of darkness into a spark of light. Now they had to help that spark grow. Officer Walsh stood nervously in the community center's main room. 20 other police officers sat watching as Mrs. Park approached him with a blindfold in her hands. Captain Park and Detective Chen stood nearby, observing the first day of the new training program. Today, Mrs. Park announced to the room, "Officer Walsh will learn what it means to navigate without sight. This is not a punishment. This is an opportunity to understand." She held out the blindfold to Walsh. Her voice was kind but firm. "Are you ready to begin?" Walsh took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, Mom." He remembered the day he had broken her cane, the fear and anger that had controlled his actions. Now he stood before her, ready to learn. Mrs. Park carefully placed the blindfold over his eyes. The world went dark. Walsh felt his heart rate increase as he lost his vision. "Now," Mrs. Park said, "I will teach you how to use a white cane. This is not just a stick. It is your connection to the world around you. It is your trust in that world." She placed a cane in his hands, showing him how to hold it properly. "Move it from side to side, like this," she demonstrated with her own cane. "Listen to the sound it makes. Feel the different textures under your feet." Walsh took his first uncertain steps. The cane clicked against the floor. He could hear his fellow officers watching silently. "Good," Mrs. Park encouraged. "Now we will walk to the door. Remember, every step requires trust." As Walsh moved slowly forward, he began to understand. Without sight, the simplest task became a challenge. His hand shook slightly as he tried to find his way. "This is how I move through the world every day," Mrs. Park explained to the watching officers. "This is the trust we place in others to respect our needs, to understand our challenges." After an hour of practice, Walsh's forehead was covered in sweat. He had bumped into chairs, lost his direction, and felt completely helpless at times. When Mrs. Park finally removed his blindfold, he blinked in the sudden light. "How do you feel?" she asked. Walsh looked at her with new respect. "Humbled," he answered honestly, "and ashamed of how I treated you that day." Mrs. Park smiled. "Good, but this is just the beginning. Next week, you will navigate busy streets. You will learn to cross roads, enter shops, and trust strangers to help you." Captain Park stepped forward. "Each officer in this room will go through this training, and this is only part one. We will also learn about other disabilities, about different cultures, about the many ways people experience the world." Detective Chen watched from the back of the room, taking notes. The program was working better than she had expected. She could see the change in Walsh's face, in his posture, in the way he now looked at Mrs. Park. As the session ended, Mrs. Park gathered everyone in a circle. "Remember," she said, "every day I teach music students that making mistakes is not the end. It is the beginning of learning. Today, Officer Walsh began his learning. Tomorrow, it will be someone else's turn." The officers filed out of the room, talking quietly among themselves. Many stopped to thank Mrs. Park. Walsh was the last to leave. He stood before her, struggling to find the right words. "Mrs. Park," he said finally, "thank you for teaching me instead of condemning me." She reached out and patted his arm. "The real test," she replied, will be how you use what you learned today to help others tomorrow. 3 months had passed since the first training session. Officer Walsh sat in his patrol car, watching the morning traffic pass by. He touched the white cane that now rode in his car, a reminder of what he had learned. Mrs. Park had given it to him after he completed the training program. A call came over his radio. Possible disturbance at 5th and Pine. Elderly man acting confused. "I'll take it," Walsh responded, turning on his lights. As he drove, he remembered Mrs. Park's words about understanding before acting. When he arrived at the scene, he found an elderly man standing in the middle of the sidewalk, looking lost. Shop owners watched nervously from their doorways. The old man held a white cane. Walsh parked his car and approached slowly. "Sir," he called out gently, "I'm Officer Walsh. Are you all right?" The man turned toward his voice, and Walsh noticed his unfocused eyes. I can't find the bus stop," the man said. "They moved it, and now all my landmarks are wrong." 6 months ago, Walsh might have seen this as a public disturbance. Now he saw it differently. "May I help you?" he asked. "I've learned a bit about navigation without sight." The old man's face showed surprise. "You understand about landmarks?" "Yes, sir," Walsh replied. "I had a good teacher. Let's work this out together." Later that day, Captain Park received a phone call from the elderly man's daughter. She wanted to thank the officer who had not only helped her father find the new bus stop, but had also taught him how to navigate the change route. Captain Park smiled as he wrote down the commendation. It would go into Walsh's file alongside the incident report from that day with Mrs. Park. Both papers told the story of change. At the evening shift change, Walsh shared his experience with other officers. Many had now been through Mrs. Park's training program. They talked about how it had changed the way they saw their jobs. Before the training, one officer said, "I saw differences as threats. Now I see them as chances to learn." Detective Chen sat in on their discussion. She was preparing a report about the program's success. Other police departments had begun asking about it. "Officer Walsh," she asked, "would you be willing to help train officers from other cities?" Walsh looked surprised. "Me? But I'm the one who made the terrible mistake." "Yes," Chen replied. "And that's why your story matters. You show that change is possible." That evening, Walsh drove to Mrs. Park's music school. He had started volunteering there, helping with security for evening classes. He watched as she taught a young blind student how to read music with their fingers. "Remember," Mrs. Park told the student, "music isn't just in your hands. It's in your heart, just like understanding isn't just in your eyes. It's in how you choose to see others." Walsh thought about his own journey. From breaking her cane in fear and anger to learning to see the world through others' experiences. He had changed, and he wasn't finished changing. As he watched Mrs. Park teach, he heard sirens in the distance. But now they reminded him not of power or authority, but of responsibility. The responsibility to serve, to understand, and to help others learn what he had learned. 1 year had passed since the day Officer Walsh broke Mrs. Park's cane. The community center's main hall was filled with music. Mrs. Park stood at the front, her carbon fiber cane now decorated with golden musical notes. She used it as a conductor's baton, leading an unusual orchestra. Police officers sat next to community members, playing instruments together. Captain Park watched from the audience as his mother conducted the piece she had written for this special occasion. She called it Bridge of Understanding. Officer Walsh sat in the front row. He wasn't playing an instrument, but he had helped organize this concert. His badge now carried a new title, Community Relations Officer. On his desk at the station sat a framed photo of himself and Mrs. Park at the first graduation ceremony of their expanded training program. The music swelled as Mrs. Park guided the orchestra. In the audience sat police chiefs from 5 other cities, all here to learn about the program that had started with a broken cane and ended with transformed hearts. Detective Chen sat next to Captain Park, holding a thick folder. Inside were the results of their year-long program. Complaints against officers had dropped by 60%. Community trust had grown stronger. The program was being copied by police departments across the country. As the music reached its final notes, Mrs. Park turned to face the audience. She couldn't see them, but she could feel their presence, their energy, their unity. "Music teaches us to listen," she said into the quiet room. "Not just to the notes, but to each other. 1 year ago, we faced a choice between anger and understanding. Today, we celebrate choosing understanding." She gestured to Officer Walsh. "Stand up, please." Walsh stood, looking nervous but proud. Mrs. Park continued, "This man made a mistake. But from that mistake came something beautiful. He learned to see with his heart instead of just his eyes." Walsh walked to the front and stood beside her. "Mrs. Park taught me that true strength isn't in showing power," he said. "It's in showing understanding. Now I teach that to other officers." Captain Park watched as his mother handed Walsh her conductor's baton. "Now," she said with a smile, "you will conduct the final piece. Remember what you learned about trusting others to guide you." Walsh put on a blindfold and took the baton. Mrs. Park stood behind him, her hands gently on his shoulders, helping him feel the rhythm. Together, they conducted the orchestra in a song about hope and change. In the audience, a young blind girl whispered to her mother, "Can I learn to conduct music like Mrs. Park?" "Yes," her mother answered. "Mrs. Park always says that anything is possible when we help each other understand." As the final notes faded away, Captain Park stood to address the crowd. "1 year ago, my mother's cane was broken. Today, we have built something unbreakable, a bridge between police and community, between fear and understanding, between mistake and growth." The applause filled the room. Mrs. Park took Walsh's arm, and they bowed together. The broken cane that had started their journey was now displayed in the police academy, a reminder that the greatest changes often start with the hardest moments. Outside, the sun was setting on another day in their changing city, but inside the community center, the light of understanding shone brightly, promising a better tomorrow for everyone.